Diffuses on the track, mix up with Halsey. Mix up with Halsey. Mix up with Halsey. Mix up with Halsey. On the mix, on the mix. On the mix, 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 on the mix. Diffuses on the track, mix up with Halsey. Mix up with Halsey. Mix up with Halsey. Mix up with Halsey. On the mix, on the mix. On the mix, 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 on the mix. On the mix, 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 on the mix. On the mix. Diffuses on the track, mix up, resources. Mix up, resources. Mix up, resources. Mix up, resources. On the mix. On the mix, 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 on the mix. Diffuses on the track, mix up, mix balls, mix up, mix balls, mix up, mix balls, mix up, mix balls, on the mix, on the mix. On the mix, 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 on the mix. On the track. Diffuses on the track, mix and mix, mix and mix, mix and mix, mix and mix, on the 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 mix For the On the mix.